Thank you so much. You may notice that the through line in my journey is storytelling. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories, and one of them is about Weeksville. Hopefully you'll find some inspiration in these stories to help you move toward doing your work. And they are, indeed, cultural bridge building stories. So here we go. I come before you standing on the shoulders of my forefathers and foremothers, who, back in the 1800s, started off on their journey toward what today has become a shining example of the personal characteristics and civic aspirations required to promote cultural diplomacy. It was just 11 years after the abolition of slavery here in New York when James Weeks, a free African American, purchased land on the edge of the settled areas of Brooklyn. This purchase marked the establishment of Weeksville, a community of free African Americans who worked and thrived in New York throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. A vibrant, self-sufficient community, Weeksville's residents established schools, orphanages, senior homes, churches, and benevolent associations, printed a newspaper, the Freedman's Torchlight, and promoted suffrage and the abolition of slavery. Weeksville's historic residents intentionally mobilized land ownership and created an alternative community to achieve institutional, political, and intellectual autonomy in a context of nationally sanctioned enslavement. Their demand for freedom and democracy on their own terms is a lesson in deliberate, calculated, and conscious planning. Today, Weeksville is a primary resource for insight into an underappreciated chapter in American history. Weeksville Heritage Center is based on a history of self-determination. Those who experience Weeksville, whether in person or online, discover an American story, one that epitomizes the qualities of entrepreneurship, engagement, and dedication to community. Our interpretation of this free Black presence in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, in the 19th century through what is sometimes called unexpected and irreverent research and programming is at once informative and inspiring to a contemporary audience. This is a story that has no racial or cultural bounds because the quest for freedom and equity is universal. For Americans of African, Caribbean, European, German, Jewish, and other ancestries, it tells, yes, a very specific story, but one imbued with universal application. For international audiences, it has the potential to do the same. Seizing one's own liberation, citizens demanding a better life, these are enduring and common goals. Even the initial purchase of this land was an act of cultural diplomacy, in that it was the beginning of an extensive journey toward cultural freedom for African Americans, and with it came the establishment of Weeksville. Indeed, cultural diplomacy allowed the Weeksville community to thrive throughout the 19th and 20th century, despite the then stigma against people of color. Today, we can boast that Weeksville Heritage Center continues to serve as a cultural bridge, not only in the preservation of this unique African American story, but also for the strengthening of cultural relationships for audiences from all backgrounds and ethnicities. Without a doubt, our American history keenly suggests that the exchange of culture and arts across the Americas contributed tremendously to the shaping of the 21st century. For another example, let's conjure up the world of American jazz and its strong relationship to Latino rhythms. In the late 1940s, world-renowned musician John Burke's Dizzy Gillespie was involved in a movement called Afro-Cuban music, bringing Afro-Latino-American music and elements to greater prominence in jazz and even pop music, particularly salsa. Although noted for his on- and off-stage clowning, Gillespie endured as one of the founding fathers of the Afro-Cuban or Latin jazz tradition. Influenced by Bauza, known as Gillespie's musical father, he was able to fuse African-American jazz and Afro-Cuban rhythms to form a burgeoning Cubop sound. Always a musician and ambassador, he toured Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America under the sponsorship of the U.S. Department of State. Quite often, he returned not only with fresh musical ideas, but also with musicians who would eventually go on to world renown. Among his proteges and collaborators are Chano Pozo, the great Afro-Cuban percussionist, Danilo Perez, a master pianist and composer originally from Panama, Arturo Sandoval, trumpeter, composer, and music educator originally from Cuba, and David Sanchez, saxophonist and composer, just to name a few. To be sure, many Latin jazz classics were composed by Gillespie during his international musical endeavors. With a strong sense of pride in his Afro-American heritage, he left a legacy of musical excellence that embraced and fused all musical forms, but particularly those forms with roots deep in Africa, such as music of Cuba, other Latin American countries, and the Caribbean. The value these Americans had in instilling positive perceptions of the United States abroad cannot be exaggerated. Gillespie taught us that passionate, meant, knowing, purposeful understandings of the true nature of cultural diplomacy are imperative. He demonstrated this in his 1964 run for the presidency, when he echoed that he would indeed rename the White House the House of Blues, and proposed a presidential cabinet with world-renowned musician Duke Ellington as Minister of State. Which brings me to my final example of cultural diplomacy in action today, an enduring legacy of Edward Kennedy Duke Ellington, if you will. There are 500 plus students in Washington, D.C., studying dance and music and visual art and literary arts and communication and museum studies, along with their academics. These students attend the prestigious Duke Ellington School of the Arts. Duke Ellington School of the Arts was founded in response to a professional arts training in equity for urban youth of color in the late 1970s. Its founders, Mike Malone and Peggy Cooper Cafritz, were determined to achieve some level of equity for these very talented students in Washington, D.C., who deserved to make a place for themselves in the world of the arts. The founders gathered a top-notch arts faculty, acquired a building, and proceeded to steward these children through 40 years of pre-professional arts training. They succeeded. And today the results of their premeditated, elective, and intended quest have been recognized by audiences all over the world and at home in the USA. Even First Lady Michelle Obama appreciates the effectiveness of their training to foster improved, greater global understanding and appreciation. In 2012, she brought the First Lady of Russia to experience their arts ambassadorship. During her closing remarks, she said, "So, you know how the arts can enrich all of us in this nation as individuals. You know how the arts can enrich all of our communities and country. And you know how the arts can come from completely different cultures and backgrounds, people who might not even speak a single word of the same language, how they might still be drawn together when their hearts are lifted by the notes of a song or a vision on a canvas or the graceful arc of a dance. And I think that should give us all cause for hope all around the world, because we know that ultimately relationships between nations aren't just about relationships between presidents and prime ministers, or first ladies for that matter. The real foundation of these relationships is about the connection between ordinary citizens, particularly young people. You, she told those students, are leading the way in this movement. Duke Ellington School of the Arts teaches us that the lessons of improving cultural understanding must first be made at home and then abroad. Inspiring interest in arts and culture and history in our youth, and then meeting that reignited curiosity about other cultures with global experiences is paramount in dispelling mistaken assumptions upon which fear and prejudice is based. In these very acts of cultural diplomacy, Mr. James Weeks' land purchase that sparked the birth of a thriving African American community during the times of the abolition of slavery, Dizzy Gillespie's international music endeavors that blew life into Afro-Cuban music, and the students of Duke Ellington School of the Arts who strive to set the bar high for global artistic accomplishment. In these acts will continue to shape the social fabric for the 21st century and inspire, hopefully, the building of cultural bridges for generations to come. But the one constant among all of these stories, among all of these folk, is their determination, their intentional and passionate creation of opportunities to share experiences with waiting audiences. Experiences that might at first seem quite specific, but are essentially universal. So as we continue this journey we've embarked upon, building cultural bridges through this international symposium sponsored by the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we now have the opportunity to exchange and compare ideas, values, and traditions. We must first realize that for cultural diplomacy to reach its full potential, it must be understood in a more profound way and from a more global perspective. Maybe history, maybe looking back to move forward, Sankofa, can help us to achieve this goal. While cultural diplomacy can seemingly provide a range of benefits in the strengthening of relationships and the advancing of core interests within diaspora communities and unique opportunities for minority and religious groups, for it to reach its full potential, a change in how we practice must be conceived. Cultural diplomacy has the potential to become a valuable tool in the strengthening of relationships between the Americas and the global community. Its potential power is reliant on the preservation of each country's national culture, its values, its identity, and its national pride. Cultural diplomacy needs ambassadors of culture from each and every aspect of our societies, with, I might add, adequate funding from both the government and the private sector. The exchange of arts companies, historical research, exhibitions, music, and an irreverent and intentional perspective, both at home and abroad, is very expensive. Needless to say, though, its rewards are priceless and are a valued investment in our future. So, let us move forward with steadfast determination preceded by a plan of action. Let us, in a deliberate, calculated, conscious, planned, meant, knowing, purposeful, advised, reasoned, thoughtful, premeditated, elected, and intended way, glean from history that which works. Extract from art that which touches the soul, and in doing so, demand support on a national and global level. Thank you very much.